GamesIndustry.biz Investment Summit online, sponsored by Xsolar. Our next session is a presentation about relaunching your Kickstarter campaign. And again, if you've got any questions, please ask them in the YouTube chat, and I'll pick up on those and come back in at the end of the session and ask those questions. So I'll now hand over to Anya Combs from Kickstarter. Over to you, Anya.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen, so give me 1 second here to do that so I can share my presentation. Okay, cool. So Kickstarter, excited to talk about Kickstarter. Let me just close this too, 1 second, if I can do that, which I have to close my screen to do that because of course, there we go. Okay. Technology, it never works for me. That's okay. Anyway, cool, great. So thank you again so much for having me. I'm super excited to, I think this is my 4th time at the Investment Summit. So if you've attended any over the last couple of years, some of this information might be familiar, but it's good to just continuously talk about it. So who am I? My name is Anya. I've been in the games industry. This will be my 12th year in the games industry, so I've been here for a while. I am the former Addicting Games developer relations person. I was the person who found a vast majority of the games for addictinggames.com, and through a lot of work there and formerly at Nickelodeon, where I was for a very long time too. I got this job at Kickstarter about 4.5 years ago, and now I am the director of games. So I actually run the games category, which is kind of cool. So what is Kickstarter? Assuming most people here know what Kickstarter is, but just to quickly touch on a little bit. Kickstarter's mission is to bring creative projects to life. We do that by connecting people to the projects that they love, and we like to think that we do that better than anyone. People from nearly every country on Earth have backed a Kickstarter project. So it's important to note here that that means that our community actually represents nearly every country and all 7 continents. So that does mean that someone on Antarctica has been pledging to Kickstarter projects, which is kind of cool. So Kickstarter has the largest and most engaged funding community. So 17.9 million people have backed a Kickstarter project, and 62 million pledges have been made to all projects. I did want to note that of that 17.9 million, 5.9 million have actually backed more than one project. So it's a high likelihood that if you come to Kickstarter and back a project, you're probably going to back another project. So quickly, Kickstarter backers have already pledged 4.9 billion. I wasn't able to actually update the slide, but we hit $5 billion pledged yesterday, which is really exciting. So this is a slightly out of date number, but if you go to kickstarter.com/stats, that gives you constant information. Like we're constantly updating that with what our stats are. And so yay, $5 billion pledged to Kickstarter. It's kind of wild. And thanks to that 5 billion, we've over 182,000 creative projects have been funded. And we'll kind of go into a little bit more about the games category, because a significant amount of that 5 billion and that 182,000 creative projects is actually the games category. So the games category, $1.2 billion have been pledged to games of all time. And about a 1.1 billion of that is successful. So about 1.1 billion successfully raised amount in the games category. 21,000 projects. To note, that's 21,000 successful projects and about 3.8 million backers. This is the full 11 years that Kickstarter has been in existence. And there's about a 40.9% success rate in games. But I did want to note there's the success rate on Kickstarter as a whole, so encompassing every single category, it's roughly like is about 37.8%. So games having a pretty high success rate is fantastic. So we don't like to necessarily look at games in 2 different buckets, but that's kind of it's kind of the easiest way to do it, which is video games and tabletop games. Video games also encompasses, to a certain degree, like VR, AR, just anything that's essentially a digital game is within the video games category. So to date, again, full 11 years of Kickstarter, 259 million has been pledged. Of that, 222 million has been successfully raised. About 14,400 projects, about 3,133 have been successful. And there are 1.8 million backers in the video games category specifically. And I wanted to just kind of include the success rate because, I put it in the last slide too, but there's roughly a 21.7% success rate for the entirety of Kickstarter for video games. But I did want to note the success rate in 2019 was actually 26.5%, which is the highest it's been since, I believe, 2016. And this year, 2020, despite a global pandemic, the success rate for video games is about 25.3%. Sorry, my chair is a bit noisy. So success rate is pretty decent in video games. However, of course, we needed to talk about tabletop games. So again, tabletop games kind of encompasses anything that's like a miniatures project, a board game, a card game, anything that's, essentially a tabletop game. There's a lot of money here. $908 million pledged, $878 million is successful. That's how much has been successfully raised. 23,900 projects launched, 14,230 successful projects, and there's about 2 million backers. So it's interesting to me that the tabletop and the video games category, despite the actual money being very different, the number of backers in each category is relatively on par with each other. And there's a 60.1% success rate in the 11 years of Kickstarter. That success rate in 2009 was 66%. And this year in 2020, again, despite a global pandemic, is 70%. So a 70% success rate on Kickstarter for tabletop games is a high probability that if you launch a tabletop project, you're going to be successful. So I wanted to look at a couple projects before we kind of go into what relaunching means, just to kind of show you like what, I wanted to highlight a couple of projects within the last 12 months that have been highly successful on Kickstarter in varying degrees. And the first project I wanted to look at was Sea of Stars. This is from Sabotage Studio in Canada. This is actually their first ever project that's been on Kickstarter. It's a turn-based RPG, but it also happens to be a prequel to their indie hit, The Messenger, which is really exciting. And if we look at the numbers here, right? So for a first-time creator on Kickstarter, over $1 million raised, over 25,000 backers, and they funded on April 18th of this year, which is pretty exciting. One of the things that they did was obviously having a very successful first indie title of The Messenger. They really focused on maintaining that community through their Discord. I think they had something like over 5,000 users alone on their Discord, which is completely independent of their Twitter and their Facebook and their mailing list, just on their Discord alone. And they spent a significant amount of time building their page and crafting their story. I kind of encourage people to look at when you launch a Kickstarter project, right, which is about 30 to 35 days. You have 30 to 35 days to really tell a story. And I think what Sabotage was able to do here was really kind of focus on spending that time to tell the story of Sea of Stars, which I think is kind of cool. Another really fantastic project that funded this year is a super just like fun, cute card game called Gladius. They spent a significant amount of time showing this game at various PAXs and local events in Seattle, really promoting the game. This game actually funded in 2 hours of launching, which is really cool. Victoria and Alex from that team, they really pushed their project. They really, they showed a lot of like kind of influential and important folks within the tabletop industry and kind of made a name for themselves as this up and coming team for Gladius, which is great. And obviously it funded on March 19th of this year. I think I talked about this project last time when it was still live. So it's been pretty great to kind of like see their success. I think their goal was definitely less than 90,000. So they very much overachieved their goal. For a first-time creator, again, they were able to bring in over 3,000 backers, which is really cool. Have to talk about Monster Prom, this is actually Monster Prom 2. They funded actually last year, but this is the 6th project from Beautiful Glitch. So one of the things that we find that's really interesting on Kickstarter is the more that you run Kickstarter projects, the more likely it is that you'll be successful. And you actually end up funding a little bit quicker each time for the most part. There's obviously caveats to that, but what we've seen as a whole is that that's pretty standard on the platform. This was actually their second video game project. They have something called the Indie G something. I think it's a zine. But they have a magazine that they also fund a lot, and they actually have it's live right now, which is really cool. I think it might be the third iteration of that. So having, coming back to Kickstarter for the sequel of Monster Prom, their first video game being Monster Prom 1, coming back with Monster Prom 2, which is really cool. Monster Prom 1 funded in 2016 with almost 1,600 backers, and they raised almost 35,000 US dollars. So coming back after doing a significant amount of community building and having like a very good sort of like first project, they did really well. They raised over $500,000, and they went from 16,000 backers to almost 9,000 backers, which is pretty wild. They funded on June 6th of last year. So I just got, put this in just within that 12 months time frame that I wanted to kind of have, which is really cool. But they did an incredible job running their project, which is great. And the last project that I just wanted to quickly touch on, just to kind of show you the range of projects here on Kickstarter, is actually Divinity Original Sin, specifically the board game. So this is the third project from Larian that came to Kickstarter. The first two obviously were Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, the video games. Both did extremely well. They took a bit of a break from Kickstarter. They're obviously, they're working on Baldur's Gate 3. They're doing a lot of projects. And so having them launch this project last year towards the end of the year, specifically for the board game, just to kind of see what that conversion would be from video game to board game, was I worked with them for about 11 months before they launched. And they put a lot of time into the play testing. They put a lot of time into sort of like really crafting a narrative, crafting a video. They worked really, really hard on this, which is like, super rewarding to see. And so they funded December 20th of last year. This is such an interesting project because they kind of also did everything that we say you shouldn't do, which is launching around the holidays, right? They funded like 5 days before Christmas. But I think this really speaks to the power of like brand recognition, and it really speaks to just Larian as people, right? Like they are, they're definitely an indie team, and they're not a big team, but they're not a small team, definitely within that sort of like sweet spot. But they're extremely hard workers, and they really pushed the game. They went to PAX Unplugged, which happened at the end of last year. They really just sort of like amplified the game as much as they possibly could. And it obviously was rewarding, right? Almost $2 million raised, over 10,000 backers. They did an incredible job. So you might be saying to yourself, okay, that's really cool, but like, what happens if I come to Kickstarter and I don't fund, right? And there's something that I just want to note here, which is that I don't think there's no such thing as a failed Kickstarter project. There are Kickstarter projects that don't fund, but that is inherently different than a project that has failed on Kickstarter. One of the cool things, and one of the reasons I say this, is that you're always able to relaunch your project, right? There's no like scarlet letter, or like there's no sort of negativity around a project that didn't maybe like fund the first time around. It's just as simple as you didn't fund, and that's okay. And there's probably a handful of reasons as to why that happened. And I sort of encourage people to kind of shift their mindset to look at it more from the perspective of like, okay, well, I didn't fund this first time around, but I probably learned a lot. And it's probably good I didn't fund this first time around, because there's so much information that I can learn potentially relaunching my project. And one of the projects that I really wanted to highlight as a project that relaunched is a small indie title called Aquamarine. It's got sort of that like Wes Anderson vibe to it. So the first time around, they came to Kickstarter in 2018, 2 years ago, and they didn't have a huge community, but the game looked it was absolutely beautiful. Like, it was a fantastic looking game, right? They did everything that we tell people to do. The thing that they were just missing was a community building part. They had a feature in Rock, Paper, Shotgun, and it got a little bit of traction, but again, it just didn't bring in the community that's sort of necessary to fund a Kickstarter project. So I did a lot of back and forth with them. I had a lot of conversations with them, and they were like, we're thinking of coming back and we're thinking of relaunching. And I was like, great. And one of the things that they did is they actually lowered their funding goal. And the $25,000 goal that you see here is already pretty low. But they actually came back with, I think it was a $10,000 goal, and they raised 16,000, just over 16,000, almost 17,000. And they had 644 backers. And these numbers are by no means like massive, right? But it's also not a project, nor was it a studio that needed just massive amounts of money or backers. They were looking for like a very small sort of like bespoke indie title. But they came back, they did a little bit of reflection, and it took them about a year to come back. And they funded this year, February 25th of 2020, which is really exciting. And we see this, like, it's not uncommon to maybe not fund your first time around, but come back, do a little bit of like kind of retool things around. Maybe your funding goal was too high. Maybe you didn't have enough of a community. Maybe you just you didn't launch around the right time. Maybe you launched on a major US holiday, you launched on a Friday, you launched around, the day one of lockdown, whatever, so many different factors of things that can kind of that can contribute to a project that maybe didn't fund the first time around. But again, I think it's important to not look at these things as failures. They're just like small little bits of information that will provide you more information throughout your process. So I know time is limited, and I do want to make sure that we allow as many people to ask questions as they'd like. So here's a couple of things to think about before you launch your project. 1, build a community. 2, show your gameplay. You need to have at least 30 seconds of gameplay. 3, keep your video short, 1 to 2 minutes in length at the most. 4, you absolutely do not need to fund on day 1 or even day 2. We say 30 to 35 days for a reason. So take that time. Similar to Sea of Stars, take the time to tell your story. Look at it as an opportunity to like give little bits of information to your community and to your backers for 30 days. And 5, talk to us. We want to talk to you. We want to help. We want to provide you with tips and tricks and information. We essentially want to be your advocates. So to get in touch with us, my personal email is anya@kickstarter.com. Or you can email games@kickstarter.com, which goes to the larger games team. And by larger, I mean there are 3 of us, so a very strong, robust, mighty team. But we are always happy to talk to you. So
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Screen. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Anya. That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Good stuff. Yeah, well, we've got some questions coming in. So
Great.
I'd like to start with Matt Glanville. Hi, Anya. Thanks for the talk. Do you have any tips for solo indie developers considering Kickstarter as opposed to teams of several people? Mm-hmm. So I think they're saying how to manage the workload of just one person, basically.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it's a huge endeavor to do anything as a solo team, whether it's a Kickstarter project or even just coming out with your first game. But that's not uncommon on Kickstarter. Toby Fox is a great example of that, who made Undertale. One-person team who did pretty much everything. But in terms of tips for like a solo creator, I mean, I don't have any tips that are like different from just general tips and tricks and advice, other than good luck. You might want to consider like hiring a community manager because that can take up a lot of time.
Yeah, and I think one of the other questions as well touches upon the community aspect as well. Doggo Dash. They're saying any tips for building a community and bringing attention to your product, and they also say how do they get to be recommended by Kickstarter?
So all of our features and promotions are managed by our editorial team. This is also why I tell people to like come speak to us early and often. We're able to advocate for you much quicker rather than, hey, my project's been live for 15 days. How do I get any promotion? Like as soon as you're thinking of launching a Kickstarter project, that's when you want to come talk to us. In terms of building a community and tips and tricks and things like that, so we recommend spending about 3 to 6 months building your community before you actually come to Kickstarter. There are so many different ways that you can build your community, right? So if we're looking at Twitter as like a social media platform because the entire games industry is on Twitter, that's one. Discord is a huge opportunity. If you can go to the Sabotage Studio Discord, who ran Sea of Stars, they have done an incredible job of really like building this community on their Discord. Other social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram doesn't really give you much, but if like that's where your community is, migrate them over to your Discord. And lastly, mailing lists. Mailing lists are like surprisingly effective on Kickstarter.
Yeah, good stuff. Some good advice there. I've got a question from Sebastian. It's about board games, actually. It said, sure. We once tried launching a tabletop game using realistic and transparent manufacturing costs, but couldn't push through because of odd pricing conceptions. I think the main, the actual cost of making the thing. So what would be your advice for a relaunch for that?
So I think I would definitely encourage you to relaunch. And I would encourage you to get different quotes. There are a lot of different manufacturers, and there are a lot of different shipping companies and teams. And it sounds like you may have gotten, I could be wrong here, but I'm suspecting that you may have only gotten 1 or 2 quotes. Try to look at different quotes in different countries. The sort of big ones are Long Pack Games, Panda, and of course now the third one is escaping me. But if you go to Kickstarter, there's a resources page that has sort of like recommended manufacturing and shipping companies that you could reach out to. And also, again, email me, games@Kickstarter or Anya at Kickstarter. I'm happy to help you get in touch with those teams.
Fantastic, brilliant. Quick question about setting the funding total.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I mean, how it's a bit of a kind of like throwing a dartboard, or
Yeah.
I mean, how do you go about working out? Is it just trial and error for that sort of thing?
For what your funding goal should be?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can tell you that typically what we see for video games is about 50,000 to about 150,000 is US dollars, is like pretty typical price ranges. Also, I apologize if you're hearing construction going on. There is massive construction on my building during lockdown, which my landlords have decided to do. But so 50,000 to about 150,000 is pretty typical. I know, as someone who has worked in video games for a while, that those budgets are very small and are probably not going to that's pennies essentially. But coming to Kickstarter to fund maybe the $1 million or $3 million that you need, it's not impossible. We've had 3 different projects in video games that have all raised over $1 million this year alone. But the likelihood of that happening is definitely slim. So I would say that if you can stay within that $50,000 to $150,000 budget, that's probably your best option. Yeah.
Good stuff. Brilliant. We've had another question from Matt Hall. How could a developer find out the viability of crowdfunding? Meaning the success could depend on the genre, type of game, things. I think you've talked in the past at our events and shown the breakdown of different genres and things, haven't you?
Yeah. So I think that's actually more about asking your community if they would back the project. So just to give you a quick insider info, right? So on the back end, we're able to kind of see the breakdown, and you as a creator are able to, you have access to this information too when you have a project, but there's roughly a 30 to 70 split. So about 30% of your pledges will come in through Kickstarter, and about 70% of your pledges will come in through your community, right? So thinking about that, you need to bring about 70% of your pledges coming through your community. You kind of want to ask your community, hey, are you all interested in backing this? Is this something that you would want to do? Are you interested in me doing it at Kickstarter? Sometimes the answer is no, and that's totally okay. And there's 2 things there. One, Kickstarter isn't for everybody, right? It's not. Crowdfunding isn't for everybody. And if your community is saying, we want to have nothing to do with a crowdfunding campaign, if it's on Kickstarter, if it's on a different crowdfunding platform, I think it's just going to be a bad experience. But the other side of this is that could also be an opportunity for you to say to your community, this is what we need. This is why we need this money, and we want you to be a part of this process with us. So opening those lines of communication and opening that dialogue, even if it is slightly adversarial at first, that's always going to be one of the best things for you in terms of community outreach and building.
Brilliant. Lovely. Well, I'm really sorry, but we've run out of time, Anya. No so thank you so much for the talk today and for answering all our questions. That was brilliant.
Thank you.
We'll be hosting this live afterwards, so people can watch it and catch up if they've missed the live session. Awesome. We'll be hosting our next session, a panel on how to pitch your game and company at 4:30 in just a few minutes, actually. Again, you can find the link to this on investmentsummit.gamesindustry.biz, along with all the links to the talks we've already had today. So another thanks to Anya, and we'll see you soon.